Welcome to the Viewless Wings Poetry Podcast, where we celebrate the craft of poetry. Each week, we feature interviews with incredible poets and artists, including Olivia Gatwood and A.E. Stallings, and original poetry read by the authors. I'm your host, James Moorhead, Poet Laureate of Dublin, California, and author of Canvas and Portraits of Red and Gray.
Dana Gioia is the former Poet Laureate of California. An internationally recognized poet and critic, he is the author of 7 collections of verse, including Interrogations at Noon, 2001, which won the American Book Award, and 99 poems new and selected, 2016, which won the Poets Prize for the Best New Poetry Volume of the Year. His critical collections include Can Poetry Matter, 1992, which was a finalist for the National Book Critics Award, and Studying with Miss Bishop, Memoirs from a Young Writer's Life, 2022. His poems have been set to music by numerous composers, including Morten Lauridsen, Ned Rorem, Laurie Laitman, and Dave Brubeck. Gioia has also written 4 opera libretti and edited 20 literary anthologies. Gioia was born in Los Angeles in 1950. He is of Italian and Mexican descent. He was the first person in his family to attend college, earning degrees from Stanford and Harvard. He worked in business for 15 years, writing at nights and weekends, before quitting in 1992 to write full-time. Gioia served as chairman of the National Endowment for the Arts from 2003 to 2009, where he created major national programs such as The Big Read and Poetry Out Loud. He has been awarded 11 honorary doctorates and many honors, including the Laterre Medal from Notre Dame, the Presidential Civilian Medal, the Poets Prize, the Walt Whitman Champion of Literary Award, and the Aiken Taylor Award in Modern American Poetry. For 9 years, served as the Judge Whitney Professor of Poetry and Public Culture at the University of Southern California, teaching literature and music before retiring in 2019 to return to full-time writing. Gioia is married with 3 sons, one of them deceased. He divides his time between Los Angeles and Sonoma County, California. Dana, welcome to the Viewless Wings Poetry Podcast.
I'm glad to be here.
I'm very excited to have you here. I love your work, and I have so many questions, more than I could fit in this interview, but I've tried to edit it down to some key ones. So
I'll try to be brief. I rarely am.
That's okay. It's a podcast, so it's a fluid in terms of time. Well, you had a book launch event recently at Arian Press, a publisher of handmade limited edition books. And publishing has changed dramatically since the days of books printed by letterpress and bound by hand. Poetry is published online. Books are digitally printed and self-published. How have these inevitable advancements in technology helped poetry and perhaps hurt poetry?
Poetry is in a very good place right now. I think most people don't fully appreciate that. They're so used to hearing that poetry is in trouble, poetry is declining. English departments are declining. Certain kinds of reading are declining, but poetry is actually a very lively art right now. And I think it's because it is a basic human medium that was created before there were books. What a poem originally took was just a speaker. And that has made it very flexible in an electronic environment. When I began writing poetry, which was 50 years ago, as a young man of 20, I conceived of poetry as being a kind of an affair of books and small magazines. You published a poem in a small magazine, and eventually you collected them in books. And then if you got famous, somebody might invite you to give a poetry reading on a college campus. That was a bit of a restraint for me because my whole conception of poetry is as a musical art. Mm-hmm. Poetry existed before writing was invented, and poetry is an art that's akin to song. In fact, in the ancient world, poetry and song were the same art. We know that because it's the same word for song, poetry, prophecy, magic. So I always wanted a poem that needed to be read aloud. Now, interestingly, the culture has accommodated me because I reach readers right now through publishing poems in magazines. I get a few readers there by publishing poems in books, and I get my books tend to go into multiple printings. I don't have a big first printing, but some of my books have gone into 7 or 8 printings. They've got a large audience there, and that's just the beginning. I recite poems in public, and I very rarely go to a college campus. I'm doing them at libraries, at state houses, at public ceremonies, in cafes, in bars, and also on campuses. But there's a huge number of venues. I now have a YouTube channel. I would not have done that. My son is a filmmaker, and he says, "Dad, you've got to do this." And I'm saying, "Oh, it's not me. I don't really, as a Californian, I've always avoided Hollywood." He said, "Try it." And I have a big audience, and people see my YouTube, either the talks about poetry or the poems, and they write me. I'm on radio sometimes. We're on podcasts. We're on Zoom. And so the thing about that is that, when's the last time you read a novel on Zoom? When's the last time you read a novel in a public reading? I mean, you could do those things, but nobody will come. But poetry accommodates and it's natural to the new electronic media because they're about speech, and poetry is an art about taking speech and raising it to the level of song. So it's a good time to be a poet.
I totally agree, and I had as in my role as poet laureate for Dublin, California, I have multiple opportunities to participate in events where you wouldn't naturally think poetry would reside, and also do poetry open mics at a local pizza place, Poetry and Pizza. And I had one event in particular where we had 15 poets. One was 8 years old, first time they'd ever recited in public. Another gentleman was 80 years old, and he'd written his whole life and never recited in public. And there was everything in between. And It was just like, wow, poetry is not dead. Poetry, there are lots of poets that have not had the opportunity to share their work publicly that exist, but there are so many more people that enjoy and create poetry than I think the media perceives.
And anyone who wants to get some kind of public performance can do it because they have open mics and they have clubs and all kinds of of places. So the country is awash in poetry. In fact, it's the fastest growing art in the United States. It's growing among every age group, every race, both genders, every educational level. Mm-hmm. And that's from National Endowment for the Arts. Very reliable statistics as part of the largest arts participation survey conducted in the world. So those are solid numbers. What is true, though, is that the English department is imploding. Mm-hmm. 50 years ago, I saw the beginning of this. They were cutting literature off from not just ordinary people, but from bright undergraduates. You'd go in there and the area of study was growing narrower and more professional. They tried to take an undergraduate and turn the undergraduate into a graduate student. But graduate school is a very different thing than undergraduate. Undergraduate, you're learning about life, you're enlarging yourself. In graduate school, you're becoming a professional. So as English departments became more ideological, more pre-professional, narrower, the joy was out of it. And they say, well, people are not becoming English majors because they're practical and need a job. No, they aren't. They're going to filmmaking and all this stuff that doesn't give them jobs anyway. Studio art. Students follow their bliss, and there's just not enough bliss for them in most English departments. Well, and I say that as somebody who loved my teachers and loved my classes.
Well, I've got one more question before I talk about your book, and that ties directly into the National Endowment for the Arts, which you chaired from 2003 to 2009. Poetry Out Loud is one of the initiatives that was launched during your time there. It's still alive and well. In fact, in my role as Dublin Poet Laureate that I mentioned before, I'm bringing that program back to our local high school next year. What role can high schools play in helping students connect with and appreciate poetry from the experience you had at the national and state level?
Well, let me tie back to your previous question. we now have, and I don't know the exact number, I should call up Washington and find out. I would guess 5 million kids or something that have participated in this program, over the course of it, because we're having 400,000 or 500,000 a year during the early years, so let's say we've got 6 million alumni for Poetry Out Loud. I don't think it's coincidental that we began to see the growth in the audience for poetry when we brought this program nationwide, because you've got 6 million students participating, but you've also got people who are listening to them, their parents, their teachers, their classmates. I mean, so I often go to high schools and if I'm visiting a school, I'll say, well, let's coincide it with your Poetry Out Loud finals. And you'll have 700 kids with 40 of them presenting. So what we've done is we've brought poetry back into kind of teenage culture. Mm-hmm. And that's had tremendous impact. As that cohort is aged, you will see the people, the number of poetry readers from 18 to 25, from 26 to 30 has doubled in the last 10 years. And it's contemporaneous with the emergence of this program. So what you're doing, I think, has more impact on American poetic audience than a lot of things that that the Poetry Foundation and these more sophisticated and better known organizations have, because you're doing it at the grassroots. Yeah. The other thing I should point out is that you hold a civic office. We don't have a novelist laureate. We don't have a sculptural laureate. We don't have a literary critic laureate. We don't have a literary theorist laureate. But there's a kind of civic common sense that the poet has a civic role, because clear, memorable, and evocative speech has a function in public life.
Yeah, and I actually, as poet laureate, and my second term just got confirmed, I'm finding opportunities, because poetry is also something that can be done with very little time. So there was a volunteer recognition event recently, and I suggested, you know what, I've got an idea for a poem built on something my dad taught me that I think would be perfect for this venue, and all I need is 2 minutes. And then that led off the event and was well received. And yes, it's very easy to logistically insert poetry into just about anything.
Yeah. Well, there's, 5 or 6 years ago, I got an invitation that kind of puzzled me, but it was to speak at the Presidio in San Francisco on Memorial Day in the Veterans Cemetery. There's tens of thousands of veterans that are buried there. And I went there. Next to me was Nancy Pelosi on one side, and then the mayor of San Francisco and people. And we had thousands of people. And they were there because most of them had lost a loved one, a brother, a son, a husband in an American war, or maybe their father. And they asked me to read 2 poems, and the audience loved it. They came up to me afterwards because, it's a civic wisdom that if you're having this memorial of the dead, that you have great language to summon them. See, poetry is a magic spell. A good poem is a magic spell. It evokes things. It brings memories, emotions from the listeners. And that's what they need. They need, evocative words so people could, in a sense, feel closer to their dead.
Well, that
necromancy is poetry.
Well, that coincidentally ties into my first question about your book. So Meet Me at the Lighthouse employs many different forms. I'd like to focus first on the Ballad of Jesus Ortiz, a long poem with rhyme and meter and straightforward language. The poem's narrative drives steadily forward and screams to be read out loud. It reminded me in a way of Rocky Raccoon by the Beatles. A short excerpt. 3,000 head of cattle grazing the prairie grass. 3,000 head of cattle pushed through each mountain pass. 3,000 head of cattle fording the muddy streams, and then 3,000 phantoms bellowing in your dreams. Share the fascinating origin story of this poem and why you chose the ballad form to bring this to life.
My great-grandfather was a vaquero. He was a Mexican cowboy, and he was killed in a bar in Lost Cabin, Wyoming, when a guy who couldn't pay his bill, who my great-grandfather was tending bar during the winter, cut him off because he couldn't pay his bill. And he was so outraged that a Mexican had told, this white guy that he couldn't pay a bill. The guy came back and shot him and killed him. And I had heard the story as a child from my grandfather, who actually had been a cowboy himself when he was young, but I didn't know the details. And then through circumstances too complicated to explain right now, I actually received, when I was chairman of the NEA, all of the documents concerning my great-grandfather, his murder, the trial of his murderer, and his marriage license. So suddenly it became real to me, and I wanted to write a poem. And so I began working on it, but it just never worked out. Every time I started it, I just gave up because it felt too artificial, too literary. Then one day, some lines came to me. Jake's family were vaqueros. They worked the cattle drives down from Montana to market. And then the next line just came. They did what it took to survive. And I realized it was a ballad. And I felt embarrassed about this because, literary poets are not supposed to write ballads, but that's what the muse was telling me. So I began working on it. And then I understood why the muse was telling me to do that. Because if I was going to write about the death of a poor person, the death of a poor Mexican agricultural laborer, a cowboy, that it should be accessible, to the people that it happened to. It should be accessible to the poor, to Mexican Americans. And the ballad is the way that poor people told their stories. So I realized it was making all the sense in the world. And in fact, I have read this to agricultural workers. I've read it to inner city people. Whenever I have an audience that's largely Hispanic, I read it and they love it and they respond to it because they recognize it as one of their stories. And I'm telling it in a way that they're familiar with, from Mexican, corridos, kind of the sort of Spanish ballads, from pop music, from country western music, from folk ballads. And so I've given it a medium that pretty much everybody who's an English speaker understands.
Well, I think that you make a key point there is you shouldn't discard a form because of it's not vogue or for any other reason. If the material screams out for that form, and I had a poem that I worked on that actually I read at a Veterans Day event last year as part of my poet laureate duties, and it was about a powerful experience I had visiting Normandy years ago on a business trip, and I had it in a very formal rhyme and meter and really strict, and it was just not working. It was hurting the story. It was almost making it, trifling it somehow.
Yeah.
And then I ended up making it a prose poem in the form of a screenplay with 9 scenes, and then it just came to life.
Yeah.
It was just amazing what that difference made.
The form you choose for prose or for poetry determines a lot of the content. But the content, you get the wrong form, the content's not coming through, because the form and the content are the same thing in a weird way. There's just two different ways of looking at what you're trying to convey. And that's why I didn't know the form to put the ballad, what turned into the ballad of Jesus Ortiz. But then when it came, I recognized it, that this is how the material wanted to be presented. Because what a ballad does, people forget this. Folk ballads, they say so-and-so murdered somebody else and this murderer cut off her head and this person ran off. They never editorialize. They just show you the events. It's very cinematic. And when I have my students, a few times I've taught form, I've had students do it, they always want to stop and editorialize. And then you ask the other students, they say, what's the worst part of the poem? And they say, it's where you're saying it's wrong to cut your lover's head off, or, this. People know that, the power of the ballad is it tells the story. It was the movies before movies existed. And usually the singer of the ballad is very distanced. There's often like one moment where the singer will come in, but it's basically, it trusts the story. And I think stories, there's some truths about existence. There are many truths about existence that we can tell only as stories.
Yeah. And I think that you're choosing that form, that the story was so strong in itself that the form helped the story just drive the poem. It's terrific. Yeah. So in The Underworld, a wonderful series of poems that closes the collection, you write, and this is just, it's a series of poems, so this is number 15. Composure. How calm you are. With such urbane composure, you notice that the woman next to you has turned to stone. Strange, but she now seems more beautiful in her alabaster skin, so delicately weathered by the years. No sudden Gorgon gaze arrested her. She drew this slow perfection from within. So this series of poems is rich with references, in this case allusions to Greek mythology. Throughout this collection, you manage to infuse literary references while creating poems that don't completely rely on readers being educated in those references. So how do you think about creating poetry that can appeal on multiple levels? You talked in the last question drove it in a poem that was intentionally very accessible. You also have poems that have multiple layers, but are still, they offer something even if you don't fully appreciate the references.
Yeah. I believe that a poet should never condescend to his or her readers. People are intelligent. They have life experience. They have an alertness to their own existence. And that what a poem does is speak to the best part of you. And it's a spell, and that spell should awaken all the best things or all the smartest things in a person. So, there are some academic poets, and this is not universal, but they really believe that the poem has to be this kind of dense verbal medium that you need to have been trained to decode. And I've never accepted that. I mean, Shakespeare was writing a poetry in his plays that the apprentices, the nobles, the middle class, could all appreciate. That a soldier and a scholar could sit in the same audience and get something. And he did not exclude people. And nor did Shakespeare constantly remind you how brilliant he was. He made you part of everything. And so, and I think that's true. That what a poet is trying to do is to engage the reader's attention and imagination and emotions. And that when you do that, they don't need to understand everything. I did not understand a lot of the poems that I loved for years. And people know this. I mean, they love Bob Dylan, but they don't know what some of the poems mean, but there's an enchantment. And what they're really saying is that they love what happens to them when they hear these songs and they hear the words. And they can have 10 different interpretations of who Mr. Tambourine Man is. But all of them work in terms of their own experience. So I try to write a poem that does two things simultaneously. And I honestly believe that this has been the secret code of poets from the beginning. You're trying to write a poem that engages your audience, but also another poet can listen to and hear differently and recognize how deep, how well made it is. And I think it's a mistake when you make the second audience your primary audience and you lose them both. And so, Robert Frost is a perfect example. When you reread his poems, they often mean something different than you thought the first time they read them. And the comment that I get all the time, and I take this as a compliment. Some people may say, Dana, it's not a compliment, but people will go, I sort of liked your poetry, but when I didn't realize how good it was until I reread it. And I take that as a compliment because I want my poems to be accessible, but to be inexhaustible if you reread them. And so anyway, and so you have something on the surface that is, the sound, the images, the story, the emotions that arrest your attention. And then you have all the hidden correspondences and harmonies.
Yeah, beautiful. Well, after my first read of Meet Me at the Lighthouse, I sought out your collaboration with jazz pianist Helen Sung. The book includes 3 poems that are lyrics in Sung's pieces, as well as poems you recite on her album, such as the title poem. How was your approach to form influenced by creating lyrics for songs?
Well, I collaborate with a lot of musicians. And so I've written 4 operas. Actually, a couple days ago, I made an agreement to write another opera libretto for Kansas City Lyric Opera. And I've written with a lot of composers. And I learned things that you need to know. I didn't know them when I began, but I know them now. And there's probably many things I haven't learned yet that I need to know and I'm ignorant of. But the 3 things that I learned that were essential if you're writing for music is, first of all, you have to keep the surface of the text clear. So if you have a poem, and let's make that with a density of 100%, which means that you've made the words as dense and meaningful and rich as you possibly can. That's not going to work for a song. Mm-hmm. You need to back off. You need to, and there are traditional ways that lyricists have worked. One of them is to have parallel syntax. So every stanza has kind of, similar sentence structures and things like that. And so you create a finished poem, but that is not so tightly written that the composer doesn't have room to get in there. Mm-hmm. The composer is going to get in there, and they're going to just change it into something richer and different from what you did. The second thing is that there's got to be somebody who performs it. So if I'm writing words that a composer is going to take and put to the music, and then a stranger is going to come along and be asked to sing them. And so you've got to write words which tell that person who they are, what they want, where they're going. They've got to become your song. They've got to become the person who could do your song. And you listen to great pop songs. A lot of them begin by telling you where I am, sitting on the dock of the bay, watching, the tides go by. It places the singer in a specific place. They'll tell you about their relationship and things like that. So that's really weird. I mean, because you don't write a poem expecting that it's going to go to one stranger, then be passed on to a third stranger, on whom the effect of the poem depends. And then the third thing I've learned is just to be lyric, to express the emotions, the personality of people in relatively direct ways, and also to use rhyme, to use meter, so that the song-like qualities become apparent. There's a reason that songs rhyme, because when you hear a rhyme, you stop and think of what the rhyme refers to. So you hear a rhyme word 3 times. You hear it when it's spoken, you hear it when it rhymes, and then you hear it retrospectively, from the rhyme. So, you get 3 bangs for your buck, on rhyme. And so I don't necessarily rhyme my literary poems. Some of them I do, but when I write lyrics, I almost always rhyme, either regularly or irregularly.
Well, you've got the perfect lead into my next question. So my father is, both my parents are musicians, retired, which means they're still musicians, but they're getting paid less. Yeah. I joke. But my father was worked for the Chicago Lyric Opera for many, many years, was a chorus master, head of music. And as a result, I grew up surrounded by opera, even got to be on La Boheme as an extra on stage. And so, as you mentioned, you've created libretti for several operas, including you've included in this collection one of the pieces from that opera, the Treasure Song from Three Feathers, which I'm looking forward to seeing by solo opera this fall. So you've talked about the differences for writing song lyrics. Writing for opera, which my parents would argue, and I would agree, is one of the most complex art forms of all. How is that even a step above writing lyrics for an individual song when it's a full libretto?
Well, a good opera has good lyrics in it. So if you think of there's moments in Puccini where there's an excerptable song. We have all heard this on concerts. So there's a lot of similarity, but opera is complicated. And I think it's because you're trying to tell a story. Now, it depends if it's comic or tragic, but for a tragic opera, a serious opera, you're trying to tell a story of life and death importance. But you have to cut it down into a couple of incidents. I mean, La Boheme takes in the life experience of four or arguably 6 or 7 characters, but the four lovers, and you've got 4 scenes. One in the one in the garret, one in the cafe, the one outside a tavern in the snow, and then in a different garret. I guess I don't know if it's the same garret or a different garret. I think it's this. And how can you do that? And so you have to compress the plot. I mean, movies take a novel and compress it maybe into 20 scenes. You're usually compressing it into 4, 5, or 6 scenes. And so everything has to happen there. And you have no ability to kind of to fudge it. And you see bad operas where they don't do the. Second thing is you can't talk too much in an opera. I mean, there are operas that are very wordy, but it's very rare. I mean, you've got maybe 12 lines to set up a major scene, versus 40 pages in a novel. And so all that compression. But the way I think of writing opera now, I think Verdi understood this. I mean, I'm writing a long essay right now in the libretto, is that you do the overall plot in as few scenes as possible, and you look at each scene as a series of emotional arcs. And so you start things, and then you raise the emotions right away, then they calm down, then you create higher a thing, and then they calm down, and then you end the scene with the highest emotions. So like in La Boheme, first they're cold and they're freezing, and they can't pay their rent, but then they have these little scenes, emotional, arcs in there. And then suddenly Mimi comes in, and she and Rodolfo fall in love. So the last arc is this tremendous arc of these two people who will be in love until the soprano dies. And, the last words of the act are amore, amore. So it goes from not paying your rent and freezing to transfiguring love. And that's what opera is. Yeah. And so what I do is I sketch out the plot, what the scenes are going to be. Then I sit with the composer and I say, well, I think we're going to have this singer sing this piece here, this thing here. We're going to have a little climax here. We're going to do it. And that's why composers love that, because that's how they work. And so we can actually take a portion of it out of sequence and say, you can work on this, start working on the themes of this, then you can sort of wrap the themes around. So I find it, I feel, and I know the composers will hate me for saying this, I think most composers don't necessarily have very good literary judgment. And so they know what they want to do, but they don't know how to do it. And you can see this when they try to write their own libretti, how bad they are. And so I feel that I have to be very domineering at the beginning and very easygoing at the end. So these are the characters you want. You don't want that. You want this. You want believable people. And the second thing is, an opera should have lyrics at least as good as a bad musical. And I see some of these contemporary operas. I'm sad because you're dying. That makes me sad. It's too bad you're dying. It's like, who would even, in the worst rock group wouldn't have lyrics this bad, but they think somehow that it excuses an opera. And I've seen librettists be on these panels saying, well, opera, the words don't matter. It's all in the music. That's stupid. Yeah. You look at the words in Puccini, they're brilliant. They're just brilliant. Now, most people don't know this because they don't speak Italian, they don't speak German, they don't speak Russian, they don't speak French. But the average quality of these lyrics are excellent. And if you only know them for a bad rhymed translation that's 150 years old, you don't really know what's going on in these operas. And so I think good lyrics invite good music. Now, I got to make sure the lyrics are transparent enough where the composer can bring in, that the lyrics are clear enough that the audience can understand it, because you face a problem in all music, but it's terrible in opera. You don't hear every word the singer sings. Now, in Gilbert and Sullivan, they would train these people with this super diction that would do it most, but especially with high voices, with the soprano's voice, a tenor's upper range, they're going to, you're going to lose the consonants. So you have to, this is another really weird thing about writing opera. You got to write a text that if they only catch 8 out of 10 words, they can still understand.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and I know with the lyric, the introduction of super titles, and in many opera companies they do this now, have brought the words back into people's awareness, and despite the slight distraction value, I know from talking to my father, it made a big difference, and it engaged the audiences even more.
Yeah, they do it. Singers and directors hate it because people are looking up from the stage, but I think it allows people to know exactly what's going on. When I am in a production with super titles, I take an entire private dress rehearsal with me and the thing to make sure that the lines are timed right, that they don't split the lines up, that they present them as poetry. And people complain about this, but then they see how much more people laugh at the opera, or how much more people are engaged. Because when you have this stupid notion that you can have the super titles slightly out of sync with the action, or that you don't break the lines up the way that they're being heard, and if you take that extra effort, honest to God, the opera is 50% more effective.
Totally.
Now, if you have really bad lyrics, maybe you don't.
Maybe it doesn't matter. Yeah. Well, I want to pivot to the shortest poem in Meet Me at the Lighthouse. Epitaph simply states, "Here lies DG, a poet who can say he didn't even have an MFA," which got a terrific laugh at Arian Press. In your 1991 essay, Can Poetry Matter, in The Atlantic, you argued in part that poetry had become too insular, poets writing for other poets, you've mentioned that. Publishing less is about reaching the general public and more about reaching other poets. How has your view changed in the last 3 decades since you wrote that article? And I think this builds on what we were talking about before, the impact of the internet, social media, the ability to self-publish books. I mean, if you were to write that essay now, how would you approach it? What would stay the same? What would change?
I'm sad to say that nearly everything I said in Can Poetry Matter remains true. And in fact, the academic environment for poetry has become worse. For all kinds of reasons. Everybody, and that's one of the reasons why English departments are just decreasing and imploding. That it's they've made themselves too remote from the actual culture of the moment, of people. They think they're being, by being politically correct or whatever, that they're embracing the moment, but they're not. They've lost touch with what the lives of most people and what most people look, and they think it's all about language. It's all about, about terms and naming, which I think is anyway, it's a whole philosophical argument you could make about that. But what I was hoping for in Can Poetry Matter was a revival of poetry. And you can see what I'm listing outside the classroom, and I use the notion of a phoenix, that fire-spangled phoenix. That it's that out of the kind of the ashes of the of one decline that you'd have this. Then I wrote an essay called Disappearing Ink, which most people haven't read. It's one of the 2 or 3 best things I've ever written, and it predicted and began to notice the very first points of an emergence of a popular poetry culture, hip hop, cowboy poetry, poetry slams, new formalism, all of these things. And so the main thing that's happened is that as the academic culture has declined, a new popular poetry culture has emerged. You're a member of that popular culture. You're a civic poet laureate. You're presenting poems at occasions that are completely unacademic occasions, with audiences that are not academic audiences. Now, once again, they may have some people that are teachers or whatever in them, but they're mixed popular audiences. And so we've seen this immense revival of poetry among the very people we were told by the academics would never come back to poetry again. Why? Because they hunger for memorable, powerful language to describe their own experiences.
Well said. So your book includes a series of psalms for Los Angeles, a city with a healthy rivalry with the San Francisco Bay Area, which is where I am right now. The poems both capture what makes a city of angels unique and critiques its challenges. In Psalm of the Heights, you write, "Move away if you wish to the White Sierras, or huddle in the smoky canyons of Manhattan. You'll miss the juvenescent rapture of LA, where ecstasy cohabits with despair. Lascivious and fitful as a pair of lovers. Let someone else play grown-up." Share how you approach writing these series of poems, especially coming from your love of Los Angeles, the incorporation of Easter eggs for locals to recognize and enjoy, and how poetry can capture the essence of something, and in this case, a city.
Well, I was born and raised in LA. My wife was born and raised in LA. She was from the nice neighborhood. I was from the crappy neighborhood. But my neighborhood had Hawthorne, California, where I'm talking about, town the Beach Boys are from. It's where Marilyn Monroe went to primary school with my mother, actually. My mother was in the same class with her one year, it's just a working class American town. Had a main street that was torn down to build a mall whose primary purpose was political graft. The mall went bankrupt almost immediately. And actually, slightly after I published this poem, the abandoned mall was voted by one architectural committee the ugliest thing in America, And so it's about going back to my hometown. Whenever I'm in Los Angeles, I'll just drive back to my old neighborhood. There's nothing left much. The apartment I grew up in is still there, still looking pretty shabby. The church at parochial school I went to is there. I have lunch at one of the places I had a lunch when a childhood, but everything has been destroyed. And so I was so deeply upset that I wrote this poem. Mm-hmm. And that generated the other ones. This is what I don't think I've ever read in public before, because it's it's about the worst parts of Los Angeles, about the thing that, it'll speak for itself. Psalm and lament for Los Angeles. And I'm echoing one of the Psalms, which is by the rivers of Babylon. I sat down and wept as I remembered Jerusalem, or Israel, I forget, which, so it goes, Psalm and lament for Los Angeles. On the streets of Hawthorne, I sat down and wept. Yes, wept as I remembered it. I came to the asphalt country of my childhood to revisit the precincts of memory. I walked the old boulevard where the shops had been condemned and demolished. I passed the bankrupt mall, defaced and boarded, and all was vacancy and squalor. Where was the drugstore where my parents met? And the neighborhood park with its Indian palms? Where was the Plaza Theater with its neon beacon taller than a church spire? I wandered the silent ruins of my city. What was there to sing in a strange and empty land? If I forget you, Los Angeles, let my eyes burn in the smoggy crimson of your sunsets. If I prefer not the queen of the angels to other cities, then close my ears to the beat of your tides. Let me stand on the piers of Malibu, blind to the dances of the surfers and the dolphins. But oh, Los Angeles, you dash your children against the stones. You devour your natives and your immigrants. You destroy your father's house. You sell your daughters to strangers. You sprawl in the carnage and count the spoils. You stretch naked in the sunlight, beautiful and obscene, so enormous, hungry, and impossible to pardon.
So wonderful hearing you read your poetry. And I think this is a perfect example of where I don't know of any other form that could capture so much, so in such a distinct form, like an essay about the rise and fall and rise of a neighborhood or loss. It doesn't have the same emotional impact, and you can convey in a couple of minutes something that would take a person 20, 30 minutes to read in an essay and more powerfully. And
and you do that in a number of ways. You do it through the music of language, because I think is a plane flying overhead. Sorry about the noise. You do it through allusion. If I forget thee, O Jerusalem, So if I forget the old last, there's let my right hand forget its cunning, but you do this and the echoes bring people back to prophetic language in this case. But having written that, I was able finally to write a poem I'd wanted to write for 40 years, a poem about the weird beauty of Los Angeles. And that's this poem called Psalm of the Heights. There's a video of it, which, that I have on YouTube right now that gets 1,000 views a day. Just people, Angelinos, this is the poem they want. When I read this in Southern California, people just come up and ask for a copy. And I get people writing me emails about their childhood, all their experiences in Los Angeles, because that's what poetry does. Poetry takes the audience, and I, in talking about my experience, honor your experience. Mm-hmm. That's why if the poem says, hey, James, I'm smarter than you, I'm more sensitive than you, I'm cleverer than you. You're saying, screw off, Dana. I got a very complicated life, very complicated inner life that you don't even know about. And so I think, what you try to do with a poem is to invite the reader to come in and bring their whole life into your poem and have the poem where it honors that. It fits that. And so that's what this does. And so I wrote that poem. And then I thought I was done. I thought it was just those two poems. And then suddenly I wrote this poem, and it's like, it surprised me. Once again, it was like the cowboy ballad. I was very uncomfortable writing about it. It's a poem about the Virgin Mary. Who's the patron saint of Los Angeles, about what does it mean to have a city that's the city of Our Lady, Queen of the Angels. Go to East LA, there's, the Lady of Guadalupe is on sides of walls. People have it tattooed on their body. They have it decaled on their car. And there's this primary memory that she is the patroness. And what does it mean when you try to take the city it was created by poor people for poor people, and you take them out of the quotient. And so this kind of visionary poem. So I have a poem of prophecy, and prophecy doesn't mean about the future. It means about taking the present moment to task for how it has failed. Then I have a poem of praise, and then I have a poem of vision. Yeah. So I was surprised by the whole thing, but that's what the muse does.
Yeah, no, it's a beautiful sequence of poetry, and it's a perfect form. So just one more question before I hand the mic over to you to read a couple of selections from Meet Me at the Lighthouse, and you've already shared one. In your book, 99 Poems, I was drawn in particular to the stories. A series of long narratives, homecoming and style were striking and unsettling. With so many poets exclusively and sometimes narcissistically crafting poems solely from their personal experiences, what advice do you have for poets to craft poetry from things that may be purely or largely imagined?
Well, first of all, telling stories is part of what poetry does. Poetry told stories before novels did, before movies existed, before plays existed. Poetry was invented to tell stories that are worth remembering. So anybody who says that, the narrative poetry is against the notion of poetry knows nothing about poetry. It's the stupidest thing to say. Sometimes you need a graduate degree to say something truly stupid. And this is an example of it. Secondly, and this is true, if you're going to tell a story in a poem, you got to tell it differently from the way you do it in prose. It needs to be shorter, more evocative. You need to treat it almost like an opera, that you have these things and you have these emotional peaks, and you do the exposition you bring into it. So a narrative poem is a sort of up and down of things, keeping the reader moving along. And you've got to have some exposition, but the exposition should be haiku-like, in its brevity, and you let the emotions run. And the language, a lot of times when poets write short story, narrative poems, they make the language prosaic. No, you don't. I mean, did Shakespeare make his language prosaic? He has prosaic lines, he has prosaic moments, but those are to set up these flights of the imagination. So, so I think it's that balancing act that, that the homecoming poem is essentially almost a full novel told in about 15 pages. And I think you keep the reader, turning those pages. The BBC, we recorded it and broadcasted on their fiction show, because it works as a story, but it has the kind of velocity and an intensity that is very much it's different from prose fiction, which I love. And I wish I had time to write, but you can only do a few things well in life.
Well, I've also found that Michael Ondaatje, who's a novelist and poet that I really love, his novels, you can tell that he has incredible skills as a poet, because he writes his novels in a very much more compact, dense way, where I think he's worrying about each word more than other. And I love Stephen King too, but I don't think he's worrying as much about every word or line to the same degree.
Well, let me just ask a simple question. I come into the room and you can hear one of two stories. And if I say, you won't believe what happened to me at the office today, or you won't believe what happened to the guy down the street, what story is going to be more interesting? Everybody knows it's going to be the second story because you heard it. And so when poets only write about themselves, their lives may be rich and wonderful, but it's probably not as interesting as the things that can happen to other people or to imaginary people. And you can take the most interesting things that happen to you, put them in that story, and add other things. And so all of my narrative poems have things that are deeply personal, things that are autobiographical, but they're framed into a story that has greater significance.
Cool. Well, now I'm going to hand the mic over to you to read a couple more selections from Meet Me at the Lighthouse.
This is the title poem of the book. One of the poems that you suggested I read. It's called Meet Me at the Lighthouse. Now, the Lighthouse is an actual jazz club in Hermosa Beach, California. It's very famous for West Coast jazz. It's kind of a dump. But, like most great jazz clubs, it's a dump in which miracles happen. There's one classical allusion here, which is Tartarus, which is the lowest region of the underworld. I talk about the All-Stars. The All-Stars, were the house band at the Lighthouse. And then I have a bunch of names, first names, Jerry, Cannonball, Hampton, Stan, Chet, Art. Those are the first names of very famous jazz musicians: Chet Baker, Art Pepper. They're just, and jazz people refer usually to the jazz heroes by their first name. It's like Renaissance painting: Leonardo, Michelangelo, Raphael. It's a form, I think, of affection. And everybody in the poem, except for me, is dead. And it's written to my dead cousin, who was my best friend growing up, who died at an early age. Meet me at the Lighthouse. Meet me at the Lighthouse in Hermosa Beach, that shabby nightclub on its foggy pier. Let's aim for the summer of 71, when all our friends were young and immortal. I'll pick up the cover charge, find us a table, and order a round of their watery drinks. Let's savor the smoke of that sinister century, perfume of tobacco and the tangy salt air. The crowd will be quiet, only ghosts at the bar, so you, old friend, won't feel out of place. You need a night out from that dim subdivision. Tell Dr. Death you'll be home before dawn. The club has booked the best talent in Tartarus: Jerry, Cannonball, Hampton, and Stan, with Chet and Art, those gorgeous greenhorns, the swinging masters of our West Coast soul. Let the all-stars shine from that Jerry-built stage. Let the high notes shimmer above the cold waves. Time and the tide are counting the beats. Death, the collector, is keeping the tab. I'm going to read two more. This one you've asked me to read, called Words, Words, Words. It's a hard poem to read because it's a very intricate stanza. And it's also a poem about writing. And it really asks the question about, what makes a poem a poem? Is it the emotions? Is it the way you use words? Is it your personal trauma that you're projecting? And so each stanza, offers one of those things, and the title, Words, 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 is a quote from Shakespeare. In Hamlet, Polonius, the advisor, sees Hamlet with a book, and he asks, "My lord, what are you reading?" And Hamlet, to be honorary, really, he goes, "Words, words, words." Words, words, words. It isn't just the words, though we have made a science of them. Eloquence excels in polishing the sentiments we need no longer say. Words are the cards, not why the game is played. It isn't just the rhyme, though we surmise the accidental insights of conjunction, the superstitious chanting we despise, but can't forget, shamed by our childish pleasure and surprise. It isn't just the pain we hope to end. Old wounds still seep their blood between the lines. The truest words subvert what we intend. They bring no ease. The cost is always more than what we can spend. It is the luck to fail at what we started, of letting language use us as a vessel, swept on a course we never could have charted, to hope that once the angel came, possessed us, and departed. So, it's a very dense poem, very complicated poem, in that I'm, playing with ideas, I'm playing with rhythms and things like that. But I think that once again, T.S. Eliot said something that I think one should believe, which is that you appreciate a poem, you experience a poem before you understand it. You love a poem before you understand it. And I think that one can hear the argument. And then there's lines which are clear. The cost is always more than we can spend, about how much effort it takes to the pain that goes into writing a poem, is extraordinary. You get a little poem out of a month, 6 months of agony. And so there's that, but that's a very complicated poem. This is a poem about my mother. My mother forbade me from writing any poems about her. Even on her deathbed, she made me promise not to write an elegy. And so this is a poem written a few years after her death. And when your parents die, you inherit all their junk. And, you have to figure out what to do with it. You hate to throw anything away, but you can't accommodate it all. So you save some things. And in this case, I've saved some Christmas ornaments, and my mother could only afford the cheapest of anything. There's one word here I realize is probably a footnote word to younger things, dime store. It used to be the Newberry, Woolworth 5 and 10. And now, now even the dollar store, is kind of a thing. But it's the place where you could buy the cheapest things. And I have an allusion in the title. When the Magi visited, Mary and the baby Jesus, they brought 3 gifts: gold, frankincense, and myrrh. So this poem is called Tinsel, Frankincense, and Fir, F-I-R, as in the tree. Hanging old ornaments on a fresh-cut tree, I take each red glass bulb and tinfoil seraph and blow away the dust. Anyone else would throw them out. They are so scratched and shabby. My mother had so little joy to share. She kept it in a box to hide away. But on the darkest winter nights, voila, she opened it resplendently to shine. How carefully she hung each thread of tinsel, or touched each dime store bauble with delight. Blessed by the frankincense of fragrant fir, nothing was too little to be loved. Why do the dead insist on bringing gifts we can't reciprocate? We wrap her hopes around the tree, crowned with a fragile star. No holiday is holy without ghosts. So those are three very different poems, although I guess two of them have ghosts in them of sorts.
Well, just one final question, and you're one example of a poet, which is where I think YouTube and being able to publish on the internet is so helpful. Is that when people are trying to learn how to recite poetry, I point them to you and to some other poets that are very good at performing their poetry. And when I spent decades writing, and only last couple of years started doing so publicly, and I hired a poetry coach to teach me how to recite poetry. It is a skill that I'm still learning. And I've hidden the videos from a couple of years ago that I did, so I'm embarrassed by them now. But what have you learned in terms of the skill of turning poetry on the page, yours or by other poets, and making it effective as a recited poem, which I view there are two versions of it. And actually, when I interviewed Olivia Gatwood last year, who's a wonderful performance poet, I recommended people read the book and then get the audiobook read by her, because you'll get two complementary experiences. So what have you learned over the years?
Well, there's two things I would advise poets. First, when you write a poem, keep saying it aloud, and not just the phrase or not just the line, but read the whole thing aloud to yourself and see if there aren't things that you could make work better as sound. I mean, there's an experience you have with composers where you'll have written a really great line and it'll say, you are the McKizzlepucks. And the McKizzlepucks is just exactly the right word. And the same composer will say, well, I'm putting that last line on a high A, and you can't put Z, K, and CH, in that I did an open vowel. And so if a composer, that's what I say about at the beginning of the process, I'm very domineering, but if the composer says, look, the singer can't sing that syllable, then I'll rewrite the line so it ends in an open vowel, and those, sometimes the composer will say, I'd love an O, a long O, or a long E, or something, but that's because the human instrument does that. So write poems that work when you speak them and you hear them. I mean, I know a really great poem because not of my own, but like I was reading Yeats last night, and you put them in your mouth and your mouth just feels great. And you can feel it in your larynx. So when you write the poems, think about how they speak and how they listen. The other thing is when you get the poem, don't stare at the page and read it like prose. I did a lot of work as a BBC cultural commentator and worked on a show for the BBC for a while called Kaleidoscope. That was a daily arts show. And the BBC, when they came in there, he told the two pieces of advice. Like, I got three pieces of advice. I'll tell you the last one afterwards. Don't eat chocolate because it dries your vocal cords. Mm-hmm. Don't eat chocolate. No cocoa. No chocolate bars for energy. Okay, that's easy. The other thing: punch your verbs. Punch your verbs. So, how carefully she hung each thread of tinsel or touched each dime store bauble with delight. How carefully she hung each thread of tinsel or touched each dime store bauble with delight. Blessed by the frankincense of fragrant beer, nothing was too little to be loved. Mm-hmm. Punch the verbs. If you do that, your reading will be 50% better instantly, because the verbs are the words that govern the syntax, and they're also the words that give you the most dynamic meaning. Now, the third piece of advice that I got about being a BBC producer is that we used to come into the studio directly after the very famous Alistair Cook. People will remember him from narrating Masterpiece Theatre, but Alistair Cook had a 65-year career with the BBC, including during World War II when he did Letters from America. One of the greatest people in the history of the BBC. He was right before us. So he was coming out, this old man, and we said, Mr. Cook, we want to introduce ourselves. We're such fans of yours. He said, do you have any advice for a young broadcaster? He said, oh, yes. And we're waiting. He goes, always urinate before a broadcast. Good advice. Good advice. So my third piece of advice to poets giving public readings is go to the bathroom before the public reading so that you can bring your full concentration to communicating with the audience.
Absolutely. Well, Dana, I want to thank you so much for sharing your poetry and your voice on the Viewless Wings Poetry Podcast today. It's been a thrill and a joy to have you here.
It's been a lot of fun. So, look forward to seeing you again, and I hope to see you at the performance of The Three Feathers.
I will absolutely. For people in the San Francisco Bay Area, the wonderful Lesher Center for the Performing Arts will have The Three Feathers live solo opera in September.
Yeah, early September. It's a great opera. So, and it's a kids' opera that adults will enjoy.
Wonderful. Well, thanks again.
Pleasure talking to you.
All right.
The Viewless Wings Poetry Podcast is written and produced by James Moorhead. You can follow me on Twitter at Dublin Ranch, subscribe to the Viewless Wings Poetry Podcast, and follow us on viewlesswings.com or on Instagram at Viewless Wings.